Look at her. Probably spent 20 years behind a desk pushing pencils, and now she thinks she can hang with the fleet. Ma'am, this isn't a library. This is a warship. People get their hands dirty here. The words, dripping with condescension, echoed off the cold steel bulkheads of the locker room. The crowd of younger, fitter-looking officers and chiefs chuckled nervously, a ripple of complicity and unease. The target of the insult, a woman who looked to be in her late 40s, with flecks of gray at her temples and crow's feet etched around calm, steady eyes, gave no reaction. She didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't even pause in the methodical way she was lacing her worn, standard-issue boots. Her movements were economical, precise, each pass of the lace through the eyelet a study in practiced efficiency. The man who had spoken, Lieutenant Commander Thorne, a man whose own hands were conspicuously clean and whose uniform was starched to a razor's edge, puffed out his chest, mistaking her silence for weakness for submission. He saw a middle-aged administrator, a supply clerk perhaps, someone who had been fast-tracked into a uniform for a shore-duty billet. He saw what he wanted to see, an easy target to bolster his own fragile authority. But when the ship's grizzled old captain, observing from the passageway, saw the specific 7-loop knot she tied, a knot taught only in the deepest, most classified corners of the service, his blood ran cold, and a lifetime of command instinct screamed that everyone in this room was in mortal danger, and none of it was from the sea. If you believe that true strength is quiet and that competence is the only voice that matters, type respect below. This story serves as a testament to the fact that the most unassuming among us often carry the heaviest burdens and the most profound skills, a truth that echoes in the silent corridors of power and on the unforgiving decks of naval vessels. The very air in the locker room seemed to curdle around Lieutenant Commander Thorne's arrogance, a tangible miasma of misplaced confidence and casual cruelty. He was a product of a system that often mistook volume for value, a man who had navigated his career by ensuring his voice was always the loudest in the room, his opinions the most forcefully stated. He viewed the world through a simplistic lens of physical prowess and aggressive posturing. And this woman, this quiet, unassuming petty officer Morgan, as her name tape read, was an anomaly that his worldview could not compute. He saw her silence not as the disciplined calm of a professional, but as the timid deference of an inferior. He continued his verbal assault, his voice a grating instrument of his own ego. I bet she's never even seen blue water, unless it was on a recruiting poster. Tell me, petty officer, what's the most dangerous thing you've ever had to handle? A paper jam? A misplaced requisition form? Again, the sycophantic laughter, weaker this time, as some of the junior officers began to sense that this was less about command presence and more about bullying. Morgan finished lacing her second boot, the knot a perfect mirror of the first. She stood, her posture not rigid like a recruit's, but perfectly balanced, a subtle alignment of spine and shoulders that spoke of a body conditioned not just by exercise, but by the need to remain stable on unstable ground, to absorb shock, to become an immovable object when necessary. She gathered her gear with the same deliberate grace, her hands moving over the items on the bench. A simple multi-tool, a small waterproof notebook, a roll of medical tape, with an intimacy that suggested they were extensions of her own body. Each item was placed into a small, nondescript pack with an order and logic that was invisible to the casual observer but screamed of thousands of hours of repetitive practice, of muscle memory forged in darkness and under duress. Thorne, emboldened by her continued non-response, took a step closer, invading her personal space. The silent type, huh? Well, silence won't help you when the alarms go off. Out here, you have to communicate. You have to be part of the team. You can't just hide in the corner. The irony of his statement was lost on him. The fact that his own monologue was isolating him, marking him as the source of discord, not her. She finally looked up, her gaze meeting his for the first time. Her eyes were a flat, neutral gray, devoid of fear, of anger, of anything he could recognize and process. They were the eyes of a watchmaker studying a complex and flawed mechanism. She said nothing. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer hers alone. It was now his, a void he had created and was now forced to occupy. He had expected a reaction, a protest, a justification, a tearful retreat, and her absolute refusal to provide one left him unmoored, his own words hanging in the air like foul smoke. It was in that moment of profound, unnerving quiet that the first alarm blared, a high, piercing shriek that cut through the tension like a blade. A synthetic, emotionless voice followed. General quarters, general quarters. All hands man your battle stations. This is a drill. This is a drill. But as the lights flickered and switched to the dim, bloody glow of emergency red, another, more frantic voice cut across the intercom. This one human and strained with real panic. Belay that drill. Real-world casualty, main engineering. Multiple personnel down, fire reported. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. The locker room, a stage for petty humiliation just seconds before, instantly transformed into a chaos of scrambling bodies and shouted questions. Men rushed for damage control gear, their faces masks of confusion and adrenaline. The world had just tilted on its axis, and the comfortable hierarchy of peacetime posturing evaporated in the face of genuine crisis. The carefully constructed facade of order dissolved, revealing the raw, unvarnished reality of a warship's purpose, to confront and overcome disaster. Amid the burgeoning panic, Petty Officer Morgan moved with a preternatural calm that was both deeply unsettling and strangely magnetic. While others scrambled, she simply took a single, deep, centering breath. Her movements, already precise, now became chillingly fluid, as if she were the only person in the room moving at normal speed while everyone else was trapped in a frantic, jerky film. Thorne, for his part, tried to assert his authority, his voice now a high-pitched bark that was more shrill than commanding. Form up. Damage control parties, to your stations. Medical, get to engineering. Move, people, move. He was shouting textbook commands, following a script that had little to do with the chaotic reality unfolding around him. His orders were noise, not signal, adding to the confusion rather than alleviating it. Morgan, ignoring him completely, retrieved a compact medical kit from her pack, a kit that was far more comprehensive than standard issue. Its contents were arranged with a surgeon's logic. She moved towards the passageway leading to the ship's core, her path weaving through the frantic sailors with an unnatural ease, as if she could anticipate their chaotic movements before they made them. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burning electrical insulation and something else, something metallic and hot. Shouts and screams echoed from deep within the ship's bowels. The heat intensified with every step, the steel deck plates becoming warm beneath her boots. It was a descent into a mechanical hell, a place where the ship's immense power had turned against its own crew. She arrived at the scene to find a nightmare. A high-pressure steam line had ruptured, filling the space with a blinding, scalding vapor. The fire suppression systems had kicked in, dousing everything in a foul-smelling chemical foam. Wounded sailors lay on the deck, their bodies burned and broken. A young ensign, his face a mask of terror, was trying to direct a fire hose, the pressure whipping it back and forth wildly. Thorne arrived a moment later, breathless and wide-eyed, the reality of the situation finally shattering his parade ground composure. He started shouting again, pointing, ordering, his commands disconnected and ineffective. Morgan, in contrast, surveyed the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance, her mind processing the chaos not as a terrifying whole, but as a series of distinct, solvable problems. Her first action was to walk calmly to the panicked ensign, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," she said. It was the first word anyone had heard her speak, and her voice was low, clear, and utterly devoid of panic. It cut through the noise like a laser. She then took the hose from him, her body sinking into a low, stable stance that instantly tamed the violent, whipping nozzle. She directed the spray not at the heart of the fire, but at the surrounding bulkheads, cooling the metal, preventing the fire from spreading, a textbook technique executed with an artist's perfection. She had created a pocket of relative safety, a space from which to work. The other sailors, seeing this island of competence in the sea of chaos, began to gravitate towards her, their panicked movements slowing, their eyes looking to her for direction. They didn't know who she was, but they recognized the unmistakable signature of someone who had been in hell before and knew the way out. Her presence was a silent rebuke to Thorn's loud incompetence. While he issued orders, she took action. While he commanded, she led. The true test, the moment that would be seared into the memory of every person in that engine room, was yet to come. She moved to the most critically injured sailor, a young machinist's mate who had taken the full force of the steam blast. His breathing was shallow, a ragged, whistling sound that signaled a compromised airway. A medic, trembling with a combination of fear and inexperience, was fumbling with an oxygen mask, his hands shaking too badly to secure the straps. Thorn, seeing the effort, yelled, "Get that mask on him, sailor, now." Morgan knelt beside the wounded man, her fingers gently probing his neck and chest. She ignored the medic, ignored Thorn, her focus absolute. Her eyes saw what the others missed: the subtle but rapid swelling of the man's throat, the faint cyanotic tinge to his lips. An oxygen mask would do nothing. He was suffocating from the inside out. Without a word, she reached into her personal kit and produced a large-bore needle and a catheter. The medic's eyes went wide with horror and incomprehension. "Ma'am, what are you doing? That's not authorized. We need a doctor for that," he stammered. Thorn, seeing the needle, bellowed, "Petty officer, stand down. That's an order. You'll kill him." Morgan did not even look at him. Her gaze was locked on a specific point on the wounded sailor's throat, just below the Adam's apple. Her hands were impossibly steady, a stark contrast to the vibrating deck and the trembling fear around her. She was in a bubble of pure, cold competence. This was her world. With a single, fluid motion that was both brutally efficient and strangely elegant, she plunged the needle into the man's cricothyroid membrane. There was a sickening pop, and then a hiss of escaping air. The sailor's chest, which had been heaving violently, suddenly relaxed. The terrible whistling sound stopped, replaced by the faint but steady sound of air entering his lungs through the catheter. He was breathing. He would live. A collective, audible gasp went through the small crowd that had gathered. The frantic energy of the disaster was momentarily suspended, replaced by a profound, deafening silence. In that silence, the only sound was the hum of the emergency generators and the quiet, life-giving hiss from the catheter in the sailor's throat. The fire was being contained, the other wounded were being tended to, but every eye was fixed on this unassuming woman and the impossible act she had just performed. The ship's doctor, a commander, finally arrived on the scene, pushing his way through the crowd. He took one look at the field-expedient cricothyrotomy, the perfect placement, the clean execution, and then looked up at Morgan, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "My God," he whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Who are you?" Thorn stood frozen, his mouth agape. The words he had spoken in the locker room, so full of arrogance and certainty, now mocked him in the theater of his own failure. "This isn't a library. People get their hands dirty here." Her hands, now meticulously cleaning the wound site with an antiseptic wipe, were steady, clean, and had just saved a man's life with a procedure most trauma surgeons would hesitate to perform in a sterile operating room, let alone in the fiery chaos of a ship's engine room. His world, built on a foundation of superficial judgments, had been utterly and irrevocably shattered by a single, silent, decisive act. The initial shockwave of Morgan's action began to recede, replaced by a ripple of hushed, reverent whispers that spread outward from the engine room. The story of the perfectly executed cricothyrotomy, of the quiet petty officer who had moved through chaos like a ghost, traveled faster than any official report. It was a legend being born in real time, passed from sailor to sailor in tones of awe. By the time the situation was fully stabilized and the last of the wounded had been evacuated to the medical bay, The ship's command structure was buzzing. Who was Petty Officer Morgan? Her name wasn't on the ship's regular crew manifest. A check of the temporary personnel list showed her assigned to the ship for a 2-week administrative audit. It was a cover so mundane, so utterly boring, that no one had given it a second thought. It was the perfect camouflage. The ship's captain, a man named Evans with 30 years of sea duty etched into his face, had been receiving fragmented reports on the bridge. But he had seen that knot she tied. He knew that what he was hearing, however unbelievable, was likely an understatement of the truth. He made his way down from the bridge, his steps heavy with purpose. He found Morgan in a quiet corner of the mess deck, cleaning her medical kit. The frantic energy of the disaster was gone, and she had retreated back in her shell of quiet anonymity, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Lieutenant Commander Thorne was there, too, hovering awkwardly a few feet away, his face pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by a toxic cocktail of shame and confusion. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Captain Evans ignored him. He walked directly to Morgan's table and stood before her, his presence filling the space. The few sailors in the mess hall fell silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Petty Officer," Evans began, his voice a low rumble. "I've had 3 different department heads, including my ship's doctor, tell me you saved at least 1 life today, probably more. They described a level of medical skill they've never witnessed outside of a forward surgical team." Morgan finished wiping down her multi-tool and carefully placed it back in its designated slot in the kit. She looked up at the captain, her expression unreadable. "I was in the right place, Captain," she said simply. Her voice was calm, matter of fact, betraying no ego, no sense of accomplishment. It was the detached tone of a technician reporting on a successful repair. Evans stared at her for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The quiet confidence, the economy of motion, the utter lack of any need for praise or recognition. He had seen it before, but only in a very small, very specific subset of the military's population. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on the still reeling Lieutenant Commander Thorne. "Thorne," he commanded, his voice hardening. "I want Petty Officer Morgan's full service record. On my desk." 5 minutes ago, Thorne flinched as if struck. Captain," he mumbled, and practically ran from the room, grateful for a task, any task, that would remove him from the suffocating presence of his own humiliation. The captain pulled up a chair and sat down opposite Morgan, a gesture of respect that was not lost on the onlookers. He didn't speak. He just waited. He knew that sometimes the most important information is offered in silence. And so they sat, the seasoned captain and the enigmatic woman, in a quiet tableau amidst the controlled chaos of a recovering warship, the unspoken question of her identity hanging between them, thick and heavy as the smoke that had filled the engine room. A few minutes later, Thorne returned, holding a data tablet. His hands were trembling slightly. He didn't look at Morgan. He couldn't. He stood stiffly before the captain and held out the tablet. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking. I have her record." Captain Evans took the tablet, his eyes never leaving Morgan's. He tapped the screen, and the file opened. A heavy silence descended over the mess deck. The captain's eyes scanned the first page, and his eyebrows shot up. He scrolled down, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise, then to profound, unadulterated respect. He scrolled again, and a slow, grim smile touched his lips. He had been right about the knot. He finally looked up from the tablet, its screen still glowing with the incredible classified truth. He looked at Thorne, whose face was a mask of dawning horror as he began to truly comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. Then he looked back at the woman across from him. He stood up, his back ramrod straight. In a voice that boomed with the authority of 3 decades of command at sea, he made the announcement. "Ship's company," he called out, his voice silencing all other noise. "This is not Petty Officer Morgan." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This is Commander Morgan, United States Navy. Her last duty assignment was Special Operations Command. She is the recipient of the Navy Cross, 3 Bronze Stars with combat distinguishing devices, and a Purple Heart. He let that information sink in, watching the color drain completely from Thorne's face. But he wasn't finished. He took a deep breath. Prior to her commission, she served for 15 years as a Master Chief Hospital Corpsman attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the name, the most classified and feared unit in the naval arsenal, hung in the air like a thunderclap. DevGru, the quiet professionals, the legends, the ghosts. Every sailor in the room, from the lowest seaman to the highest officer, understood the implication. They were in the presence of royalty, from a kingdom they had only ever heard about in whispered rumors. The captain turned to Morgan, and in a gesture that stunned the entire crew, he drew himself to attention and rendered a slow, perfect salute. It was not the perfunctory salute a captain gives a subordinate commander. It was the salute of a warrior to a master of his craft, a mark of ultimate respect that transcended rank. "Commander Morgan," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. "Welcome aboard my ship." "It is an honor." Commander Morgan stood and returned the salute with a crisp, economical motion. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her voice still quiet, still calm. "Happy to be here." Her eyes, for just a fleeting second, flickered towards Thorne. There was no triumph in them. No, I told you. So there was only a quiet, professional assessment. And in that moment, Thorne understood the deepest, most painful truth. She had never been in a battle with him. He had been so far beneath her notice that he hadn't even registered as a threat. His loud, arrogant insults had been nothing more than the buzzing of an insect, a minor annoyance in the profound, disciplined silence of her world. The legend of Commander Morgan spread through the fleet like a shockwave, a modern naval myth passed from ship to ship, from port to port. The story was told in hushed tones in chiefs' messes, in excited shouts in the barracks, and in formal, analytical detail in officer wardrooms. It became a cautionary tale, a parable about the dangers of assumption and the true nature of strength. The tale grew with each telling, acquiring the patina of folklore. Some versions claimed she had performed the surgery with a sharpened spoon handle. Others swore she had single-handedly fought the fire for 10 minutes before help arrived. The truth, as is often the case, was more impressive than any of the fictions because it was real. It was a story of pure, unadulterated competence, a quality more revered in the military than any medal or rank. The effect on the ship's crew was profound and immediate. A new culture began to take root, one that valued quiet professionalism over loud posturing. Junior sailors started watching the older, more experienced hands not for their boasts, but for their actions. They learned to recognize the subtle signs of expertise, the methodical way a master chief troubleshoots a faulty circuit, the calm precision of a seasoned navigator in a storm, the quiet confidence of a bosun's mate handling lines in heavy seas. They were learning to see beyond the uniform, to look for the substance beneath the surface. For Lieutenant Commander Thorne, the experience was not just humbling, it was transformative. The foundation of his identity had been built on a brittle framework of ego and prejudice, and Morgan had shattered it with a single, undeniable act of skill. For days, he was a ghost, moving through his duties with a vacant expression, the captain's words echoing in his mind. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He had mocked a living legend, a woman who had likely endured more hardship and faced more danger in a single deployment than he would in his entire career. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it difficult to breathe. He knew he had to face her. He found her in the ship's small library, a place he had once used as a punchline for his insults. She was reading a thick, technical manual on advanced damage control theory. She looked up as he approached, her expression as neutral as ever. Thorne came to a rigid, formal position of attention. "Commander Morgan," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I have no excuse for my conduct. My words were unprofessional, unacceptable, and ignorant. I'm deeply sorry. I formally apologize, ma'am." He stood there, braced for a reprimand, for a lecture, for the career-ending rebuke he knew he deserved. Morgan closed her book, marking her page with a finger. She studied him for a moment, her gray eyes analytical. "Your apology is accepted, Lieutenant Commander," she said. Her tone was not forgiving, nor was it condemning. It was simply a statement of fact. Your assumptions were based on incomplete data, a common tactical error. The lesson is to gather better intelligence before you engage. She then reopened her book and resumed reading, the conversation, for her, clearly over. The simplicity of her response was more devastating than any punishment. She hadn't just forgiven him. She had analyzed his failure, categorized it, and filed it away as a teachable moment. It was the ultimate expression of her professional ethos. From that day forward, Thorne was a changed man. He stopped being the loudest voice in the room and started being the most attentive listener. He began to mentor junior officers, not with bluster and intimidation, but with patience and a newfound humility. He often told the story of his own monumental arrogance, using himself as an example of the rot that can creep into a command if ego is left unchecked. He became a better officer, a better leader, because a quiet woman in a library had held up a mirror and forced him to see the man he truly was. She had saved more than one life in that engine room. She had also salvaged his. The ship became a living embodiment of the lesson Morgan taught. A small, brass plaque was mounted on the bulkhead in the engine room, near the spot where she had saved the young sailor. It didn't bear her name or rank. It simply read, "Competence is the only voice." It was a quiet, constant reminder. The training drills on board took on a new seriousness, a new focus. The crew practiced not just for the scenarios they expected, but for the ones they couldn't possibly anticipate, knowing that the true test of a team is how it responds to the unknown. The spirit of quiet professionalism she had modeled became the ship's unofficial motto, a standard to which every sailor, from the captain down to the newest recruit, aspired. Commander Morgan remained on board for her designated 2 weeks, completing her administrative audit. She spoke little, observed much, and moved through the ship with the same unassuming grace. She would occasionally stop to offer a quiet word of advice to a young sailor struggling with a complex task, her instruction always clear, concise, and devastatingly effective. She taught a young electronics technician how to diagnose a recurring radar fault by listening to the specific pitch of the cooling fans. She showed a culinary specialist a more efficient way to break down a side of beef, a technique she had likely learned for field dressing large game in some forgotten wilderness. Each small lesson was a ripple spreading from her deep well of experience. The day she was scheduled to depart, the entire crew, from the off-duty watchstanders to the department heads, spontaneously lined the passageways from her temporary quarters to the quarterdeck. It was not an order from the captain. It was a spontaneous, heartfelt gesture of respect. As she walked the gauntlet of silent, watching sailors, no one spoke. There were no cheers, no applause. There was only a profound, reverent silence. It was the only tribute that felt appropriate for a woman who had taught them the immense power of that very thing. As she reached the top of the gangway, she paused and turned. She looked over the assembled crew, her eyes sweeping across their faces. Then she gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared understanding. Then she was gone, disappearing into the vehicle waiting on the pier as quietly and unobtrusively as she had arrived. She left behind not just a saved life and a humbled officer, but a transformed culture. The story of Commander Morgan became a permanent part of the ship's identity, a foundational myth passed down from one crew to the next. New sailors arriving on board would hear the tale during their indoctrination, and they would see the plaque in the engine room, and they would understand the standard that was expected of them. The legacy she created was not one of battlefield glory or public accolades, but something far more potent and enduring. A culture of quiet competence, a community of professionals who understood that true worth is not declared with words, but demonstrated through action. Her presence had been a catalyst, proving that one individual, living by a code of excellence and humility, could fundamentally alter the character of an entire command. Years later, a young, newly commissioned ensign, fresh from the academy and full of nervous energy, reported to the ship for his first tour of duty. During his check-in process, he was met by the ship's executive officer, a respected and thoughtful leader known for his calm demeanor and his exceptional ability to mentor junior officers. The XO was a man who chose his words carefully and never raised his voice, a man who commanded loyalty not through fear, but through an unshakable competence that inspired confidence in everyone around him. The ensign, eager to make a good impression, noticed the small brass plaque in the XO's office, a replica of the one in the main engine room. It read, "Competence is the only voice." The ensign, curious about the ship's history, asked about its meaning. The executive officer leaned back in his chair, a faint, knowing smile on his face. He looked at the young officer, seeing the same mix of ambition and uncertainty he himself had possessed so many years ago. "That plaque," the XO said, his voice quiet but resonant, "reminds us of the most important lesson this ship has ever learned. It reminds us that you can't judge a person's worth by their rank, their age, or the volume of their voice. It reminds us that the most dangerous person in any room is usually the one who doesn't need to tell you they are." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle on the young ensign. "We had a commander visit us once," he continued, his gaze becoming distant, as if looking back through time. "She taught us that respect is earned in silence and proven in crisis. She taught us that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It just is." The executive officer leaned forward, his eyes locking with the ensign's. "Your job, ensign, is not to be the loudest. It is to be the best. Be quiet. Be professional. Be so good at your job that your skills speak for you. If you do that, you will honor the legacy of this ship, and you will never go wrong." The ensign nodded, a profound sense of purpose settling over him. He was no longer just joining a ship. He was becoming part of a legend, a tradition forged in fire and humility. The executive officer stood and extended his hand. "Welcome aboard," said Commander Thorne. "Now, let's get to work." The cycle was complete. The lesson had been passed on. The quiet professional's legacy was not something left behind. It was something that continued forward, carried in the hearts and actions of those she had inspired, a silent, powerful current running through the steel veins of the ship, ready for the next storm, the next fire, the next test. True impact is not a momentary explosion. It is a permanent change in the climate, a raising of the standard that endures long after the catalyst is gone. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where professional skill defines a hero's worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.